going to interview an author, an intellectual mind, a leader. He's a professor at Barnard. He wrote this book called Scarcity. It's a history of the origins of capitalism to the climate crisis. Interesting. Very, very timely. It's a great book, and he's got a lot of interesting ideas. And, you know, he's here in New York, so let's bring him right up. Please welcome to the stage, Carl Wennerlind, everybody. There's us right there in a spooky library. You don't like that? No. You don't like? All right, sorry. That's what Google Images fed me. You know. All right, how you doing? All right, there you go. Put the mic up to your mouth. There we go. No problem. No, I know you've probably got nerves right now, huh?
No.
You're.
I follow this all the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
all right.
No problem.
Sure. Yeah. He watches all the episodes. All right, let's keep it going. All right, let's just start this. Okay. So your book is great.
Thank you.
I did read it. Thank you. One person appreciates that. You know, read the whole book. Most interviewers don't. All right, here's the question. So scarcity. People are probably wondering, wow, that's an interesting. Why did you go from an angle of scarcity?
So we're talking about drugs before. One of the worst drugs that we have is addiction to economic growth.
Yeah.
Economic growth is, of course, fantastic in many ways, but it also tends to generate all kinds of side effects, climate change, resource exhaustion, mass extinction, and growth is, of course, one of the reasons for this. So what are then the culpable forces behind economic growth? And one can look at a bunch of different reasons, but we, in this book, my co-author and I, suggested that it's a change in mentality that happened in the 18th or 17th century that has created a way of understanding ourselves and our relationship to nature. And we become absolutely addicted to this idea of infinite economic growth. We think that growth is going to fix everything. But now we're in a situation where we need to rethink growth. And in order to do that, we need to go hard at modern economics. And modern economics is based on the assumption that everything is scarce. And that assumption is based on the idea that we always want more, constantly want more, and also on the idea that nature is infinitely expandable, which it's now turning out not to be the case.
Now, and this is an important point to highlight. So the reason it seems like you came at it from the angle of scarcity as opposed to the just straight up history of capitalism, is that the way people approach scarcity reveals the ideology in the way people measure money and measure the growth and all that stuff. So the terms you use, the idea that it's all infinite, the idea that humans innately are insatiable and will keep consuming past this. And I thought that was very interesting because those are some things that people just take for granted. People just take for granted that everyone's just going to consume until there's no bottomless. But that's not necessarily true. And I thought that was another interesting part of the book. You show the growth and the development of the thought. And even when these things became popular, like, you know, when capitalism hit its stride and all that, there were still people kind of saying, like, no, you're mistaken.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go back all the way to you know, the 14th, 15th century, there was, of course, scarcity. There's poverty. There's all kinds of dearth. There's all kinds of insufficiencies. But the way that people understood their relationship to nature was very different. Back then, people thought about nature as being kind of sacred. Nature was a space in which one lived, saw one's family evolved. One had an existential relationship to nature. And in terms of desires, if you look at any religious text, it's all about curtailing desires. So it was an effort to try to create a balance between nature and humanity so that humanity could exist in relative peace with one another. And then we trace about 9 different changes in the way that people have thought about the relationship between nature and human nature.
Yeah, and there were certain things. I mean, we once again, we take everything for granted. We think in modern times, like the last 200 years. But and that's kind of where we got our way of thinking, like when it comes to industry and technology and money. Yeah. These kinds of things came along at some point and completely changed the way we approach not only nature, but each other. You know, the way we see each other as commodities or labor or whatever, and those things haven't always been this way, even though we like to think of them that way, or some people like to think of them that way.
Yeah, I mean, so commodification that we tend to think of as starting in the 17th century, where land was made into a commodity, and that was a commodity like any other that was designed to be accumulated. We invented money, we invented credit, we also invented science to try to extract as much out of nature as possible. And that generates a kind of mindset in which people slowly started to believe in the possibility of infinite growth. And at the same time, we moved to a more secular society, and that society is no longer condemning infinite desires for more and more goods. It became accepted. It became a sort of part of modern culture. So you have infinite desires that's driving infinite growth, and technological inventions and scientific refinement is the kind of origins of that. And that actually has its origins in alchemy, with a bunch of people started to experiment with the way that nature actually operated, the unseen aspect of nature, and they started experimenting with that and realized that there's tons of value that we can extract from nature, and that set this whole train in motion. And don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of good things that have come out of that, but also a lot of horror, and what we're now facing is this dire circumstances in which we have to roll back growth in order for the globe to be inhabitable for the future.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, there was a point in history. It's kind of, close your eyes and imagine. You're just living on the grass. You got your tent, your family running around, your kids running around, playing the one game that was around, wooden stick. I don't know what game. And someone just comes over your house and says, this is ours now. They just basically enclose their land and say, this is ours, you gotta leave. And so at that time, people are like, what are you talking about? The way you approached land, the way you approached resources, each other, was totally different. And once that happens, everything slowly starts to change, literally almost by force. And it is by force. That's what, basically what the militaries or whatever were used for. And so now we're living in a time where we take all those things for granted, but there were plenty of times in history where that hasn't been the case. And I thought that was really interesting. You talk about also how you talk about alchemy, which I thought was interesting. By the way, alchemy is like people like with little beakers, and you look at like people with all their crazy inventions, and if I mix these two things, and I'll make gold, and I'll just be the whatever. So like crazy people. Although some people like Isaac Newton was kind of an alchemist, and he ended up stumbling on gravity. Nice save. But it's funny how that was actually a thing, and like you were saying, and I thought what was interesting about the book is you tie the the view of scarcity to other sciences. So we forget that the way of looking at each other of scarcity and economics and all that stuff permeates into other fields. And I thought, for example, you talked about, so Robert Thomas Malthus used to think, he's basically a pessimist who thought about how everything's going to run out, population's going to dwindle, right? I'm very paraphrasing. But my point is that bled into Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin's way of this whole idea of Darwinism and survival of the fittest and all that stuff because of this way of looking at the world. And I thought that was interesting. You could talk about how the way we look at scarcity today, for example, bleeds into our everyday life.
What's interesting with that era is that there's Malthus then suggesting that humanity or the number of people will grow much faster than the land is able to nourish them. So at one point or another, there's going to be a lot of war, there's going to be a lot of pestilence, and that will lead to a lot of dying off of the population. So humanity gets stuck in what's called a Malthusian trap. Right? So we can't really get to a point where its standards of living keep on increasing on an exponential way. Sooner or later, nature would kind of retaliate and bring us back to this basic standard of living. So he didn't see the possibility of science. He didn't see that science was able to actually extract more resources out of the land and that we can innovate and invent all of these other aspects. What's happening at the same time is that some early economists are sort of fueling this idea of infinite economic growth by arguing that once we actually become wealthier, we're also going to become more refined. So we're going to shift our interests away from consumption to poetry, to music, to conversation, to commerce with one another. And that will actually automatically tail off or limit the pressure that we put on nature. So really the idea of modern economics where we constantly want more, we're insatiable, like whether you're poor or rich, there's always more to be had. That is an innovation that is introduced in the latter parts of the 19th century. And that's a social construct. And the problem with
A
that is
self-serving one too.
It's
a
self-serving
as well.
one because
Yeah.
it's one that was popularized by bourgeois or pro-capitalist journalists, intellectuals, industrialists, because they wanted to find a way to legitimize capitalism. And they wanted to do that vis-a-vis the ideas of Marx and Engels and a bunch of radicals and anarchists and communists who were very much opposed to this idea of thinking about the human race existing only for the purposes of economic growth and economics expansion.
Yeah. Question for you guys. How many of you guys thought you were going to go out on a Saturday night and hear the words Malthusian trap? Those are bragging rights. Go to your friends who went to the axe throwing place and tell them what you heard. Well, that's interesting. You got to the present day, because I think this is interesting. You talked a lot about neoclassical scarcity, which is kind of what we're starting to get into, which is kind of the present umbrella we're under, and it basically talks about insatiable desires, and also that scarcity is kind of unavoidable. So we're kind of all fighting for this stuff. But there were people, once again, like you mentioned, Mark, who questioned some of these principles. You talked about Zola talking about questioning this idea of insatiable nature. You talked about Rousseau talking about the amour de soi and the amour propre or whatever, and the difference is there. Like, one is where you're selfish for the purposes of, he kind of makes a distinction. He's like, yeah, all humans are selfish, but only to get their basic needs met. There's another type of selfishness, which is the selfishness to feel superior to others, for example, and that kind of stuff. And not everyone has that, and that's something that's kind of taught, right? Yeah. I was hoping you could talk to this idea that, and where we're living in today, and how I guess people kind of have internalized this.
I mean, it's so easy to say that, we've always been selfish, we always want more. Every person on the globe is sort of operating with this ideological framework. But people like Rousseau in the 18th century and many others after him try to historicize the idea of selfishness. And he acknowledged that people are selfish by nature, but it's a selfishness that's about self-preservation, what he called amour de soi. And then we also have, as a basic psychological disposition, is that we have pity. We actually care about other people. We go into their minds and we figure out how they feel in a situation. So that means that we have an other regarding principle embedded in our mind. But once capitalism is introduced, he argues that slowly we evolved towards a moment where we move from amour de soi to amour propre, which is another word for vanity. Right? We care only about our well-being insofar that it belittles you. That we only care about consumption insofar that it gives us prestige, power, and status. And that pity faculty that we used to have becomes something called self-identification. So that means that I only think about you as a vessel which I can enter and look back at myself, to feel the joy of modernity, which is superiority over other people. So that's one way of historicizing selfishness. There are many other different kinds. Marcuse talked about, well, I won't go into too many of those, but it's a way to kind of make the point that we don't want to fall into the trap to believe that anything is natural, because all of the institutions, all our behaviors, at least to historians, are socially constructed. And they're socially constructed in a political moment, in an economic moment, in a scientific moment. And many times these concepts are introduced for a particular purpose, right? And those are often ideological purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, round of applause for Carl's French accent, huh? How about that? Hands off, ladies, he's married, all right? Yeah, no, and you're right. I think that's an important thing because I think also, before I read this book even, you think of economics as a science. Like, you go to class in college and it's all these graphs and things go up. You do this goes down. You do this, it goes up. When it's all based on, they take things for granted. There are certain assumptions those graphs and laws or whatever, or theories are based on And those, at the end of the day, are ideological assumptions. And that's kind of what you're getting at in the book a little bit. Well, then this takes us to the next thing, which is where we are today. And kind of what we need to kind of be thinking is, resources are a problem. I don't know if you guys have noticed, you've gone to the copper mine lately or anything, but they're an issue. And you talk about this, the latest one is planetary scarcity. And you talk about these different ideas. I thought there was a section on Buddhist economics, spaceship economics, which I thought was interesting. But to sum that one up, is this idea that we should think of economics as we're on a spaceship traveling to a different place with only a certain amount of things to work with, and we have to kind of work in a circular way rather than going to mines and just getting an endless supply from there are certain ways of looking at economics that could kind of fix where we are. I was hoping you could talk to that for a little bit.
So, there's different
Mike.
ways in which one can address that question. So some people argue that we need to move into a moment of degrowth, that we actually have to stop growth entirely and even shrink the economy in order to shrink our footprint. We, in the book, talk... Because primarily what we're interested in is the intellectual history of this. So we're interested in finding different ways of understanding nature, understanding humanity, and understanding the relationship between the two. And to do so, we have to opt for different assumptions about behavior, different assumptions about institutions, how they might work, and different assumptions about how we can see humans entering a kind of different behavioral era. And so drawing on religion, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism, there are ways in which one can encourage people to obtain different types of values, different types of pleasures, different types of stimuli that they seek. There's also ways to get people to think differently about nature, not to think of nature as something disposable, something that's an economic resource designed for us to exploit, but instead to think more as a cosmology where humanity and nature exist in a different type of grand narrative, right? And many times, sort of religious, and we're not advocating for any particular religious framework, but
Scientology.
Yeah,
This is all. We got pamphlets on the way out, guys. That's what this whole thing has been for. Just so you know, don't be surprised. Yeah. No, I think that was. I guess before we move to the next set of questions, which are very important. You're working on a book now. It's a history of. Is that right? You're working on a history of capitalism. Is that right?
Yep.
That's pretty big undertaking.
Yeah, but it's a small book. So a small book on the idea of capitalism, trying to get to try to provide an aid for right-wing people and left-wing people to actually be able to talk to each other
choose your own adventure.
About the sort of implications
Nice.
and normativity of capitalism.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for stepping away from writing to come out here tonight.
Indeed.
I don't know how authors write their books. I don't know if you just put prompts into ChatGPT these days and just press enter. Give me the history of capitalism, enter. Here's my book. No, I'm sure as a professor you get a lot of that, huh? People cheating?
No comment.
Well, I didn't do that. I read the book. That's right. All right. Well, look at us. We're just rambling away. People are like, who is this man talking to us about Malthusian traps? We want to know about this guy. Well, it's good thing for you. We're getting to the rapid fire questions. Yeah, there we are. Look at our faces are on fire. Rapid fire questions. Yeah.